we really appreciate your participation, and I'm hopeful that we'll get a lot out of this, and as you will too. So before we go into depth on the guidance, I wanted to provide a few overarching thoughts about our guide and its utility. First, and I think foremost, I wanted to stress that a prerequisite for success in conducting an alternatives analysis in our framework is obtaining a good understanding of the regulations. It's really important that you understand that that's the rule of law, and it's really the standards that you have to meet. Our guide doesn't create any new standards or obligations, but rather it's really an attempt to provide helpful information and resources that can help you go through that process as dictated by our regulations. So it's really a compilation of tools, methods, approaches, examples, and insights that are there to help you. So today we want to get some feedback on how helpful you think it is. One way to think of the guide is, in my view, is really that it's somewhat like the building code for building a house. The regs are really the building code, not the guide. And you, if you're the practitioner of the alternatives analysis, you're the general contractor, you're also the architect, and you also have to get a plumber and a carpenter and someone to pour the concrete, all these things to build your AA. You have a lot of latitude in how you go about doing that within the construct of the regulations. So what the guide does is just point to different tools and resources that can help you out in that process. Another thing I wanted to point out is that unlike many regulations and standards out there, the guide is just to help you go through the regulations, which really require that you make a lot of decisions, that you do a lot of analysis and evaluate what are relevant factors, the approach you're going to take, how you deal with things like data gaps. And ultimately, you need to compile all that information and tell DTSC your story. We're going to talk about how the guide goes through step by step, chapter by chapter. But it's also important to know that it's not really a linear process, is that ultimately you have to tell your story, and you may have to go back as you're building that story and consider information that comes up later that you didn't have earlier in the process. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So overall, we're happy to have this opportunity this morning to present this to you. It's really important to us that we get your feedback, not just today at the end of the webinar, but most importantly, if you could take the time to go to our CalSafer tool and provide us your insights, your concerns, your recommendations, suggestions. That'll be very helpful for us as we finalize this Stage 1 guide and move into Stage 2. I just want to highlight that it's the start of a process, that we're going to have another webinar on October 21st. Hopefully we'll get some good feedback after today that we can take into account for the next webinar. And additionally, I wanted to let people know that we'll be posting soon that our next Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting will be held on November 12th and 13th. And we anticipate that we'll be discussing the Stage 1 Alternatives Analysis Guide at that meeting. So this will all be very helpful in framing that as well. So again, thank you for your help in this process, and welcome aboard. I'm now going to turn this over to Relly Briones, who's a senior engineer on our alternatives analysis team, to go through the guide.
Thank you, Carl. Good morning, everybody, and for the East Coast people, good afternoon. And again, thank you for participating in this webinar. In this presentation, I will give an overview of the guide and present the key points of each chapters. Please review the regulations. As Carl said, since the regulations establish the process of conducting DAA and the requirements. By knowing the regulations, you will have a better understanding on why the guide was organized as such. We also would like to use this opportunity, this webinar, to solicit comments for the guide. Please give us your feedback on how we can improve this guide, because this is for you and we would like it to be useful. You may already have a copy of the draft guide, but for those of you who haven't downloaded a copy yet, you can download it by going to our Safer Consumer Products website And this is our alternatives analysis page where you can get information about the alternatives analysis process and also to click on the CalSafer button where you can go to CalSafer. And this is a screenshot of the CalSafer web page. And you can download the guide from this button, Draft Stage 1A Guide, and this is also the web page where you can submit comments through CalSafer. Again, the comment period for this draft guide, you can send comments through CalSafer until October 23. So CalSafer will accept your comments through October 23. Now let's talk about the alternatives analysis process. The regulations establish a two-stage process. During the first stage, the responsible entities would be identifying the alternatives and screening them for further evaluation in the second stage. A preliminary AA report is prepared to document the analysis and the data used and assumptions and submitted to DTSC for review and approval. In the second stage, it's a more in-depth analysis of the alternatives that had been screened out from the first stage. This is where decision is made on what alternative is to be selected. Note that there are also other options, compliance options, other than this two-stage process, just like the abridged alternative analysis, the alternative process AA, and the previously completed AA. We will not talk about these other compliance options, but then we'll focus on the first stage process. Just a comment on this process flowchart. You may notice that there's a public comment after the final AA report. This is not the typical public comment process similar to regulatory public comment required, but then the final report will be posted on our website, and we will be soliciting public comments, and DTSC will be reviewing these comments and send those relevant comments to the responsible entities if we feel that those are relevant to alter the conclusion made on the report. So the responsible entities will be doing an addendum on their final A report based on these public comments, which were reviewed by DTSC. So again, this webinar will focus on the first stage AA process. About the guide, it is important to note that this is not a regulatory document, and Carl mentioned that already. It does not create a new legal requirement. It does not change the regulatory requirements that are already established. What it is that it is an advisory resource to help responsible entities fulfill the regulatory requirements. It helps people understand the process by describing the steps and by providing some examples. What it is that it provides information about the two-stage process. It describes approaches for conducting the AA steps, approaches for identifying and collecting data. It describes various tools and methods that may be used for the specific steps. And to illustrate steps in the analysis and to make it clear, it's providing examples as appropriate. It presents a menu of approaches and does not provide a single specific approach because there are several approaches that may be used by the responsible entity, and it gives flexibility for responsible entities to choose the approach that they feel will work for their situation. In preparing this guide, we reviewed several reports, documents, case studies, and we found several valuable reports, valuable information about AA principles When I say AA, I hope that everybody understands that I'm referring to alternatives analysis. So I'll be using the term AA a lot of times. So anyway, yeah, when we prepared this AA guide, we reviewed these documents, and then we found the concepts and principles described in these documents as very useful and very valuable. So we may have presented the same concepts and principles and presented them in our guide. The guide is organized according to The guide is organized according to important topics related to the conduct of the alternatives analysis. The chapters are ordered to roughly follow the steps outlined in the regulations, from identification of the product requirements to the identification of relevant factors, assessing of the impacts, and ultimately on the screening of alternatives. The first stage AA, we can call it as the screening analysis, because this is where screening of alternatives is done. And the screen out and in the screen alternatives, there will be a narrowed list of alternatives that will be evaluated further on the second stage. And these are the chapters that will comprise the second stage AA. These are still under development and under internal review, and we expect that these chapters will be ready for public comments by spring of 2016. We will not talk about these second stage chapters, but we will focus on the draft AA guide, which covers the first stage process only, the recently released draft guide. The second stage involves a more in-depth analysis, and this is where the selection of a safer alternative is being done. The first chapter of the guide introduces the AA framework, and it emphasizes on the two-stage process, which we already have discussed. The first stage, which is the screening stage, and the second stage, which is where more in-depth analysis is done for selection of the alternative. And we also talk about the other compliance options, which are the abridged AA. What's important to note on Chapter 1 is that there's an appendix in Chapter 1 that provides a summary of the required information for AA reports. This required information are established in the regulations, and it would tell you about what should be included in the executive summary, what should be included when discussing comparison of alternatives, or when identifying relevant factors. Responsible entities can refer to this appendix to check and review their AA reports for completeness. And again, since this is just a summary and it's from the guide, we strongly advise you to use the regulations when referring to the requirements. The initial steps in conducting the alternatives analysis is the identification of the requirements for the product. Before alternatives can be identified, responsible entities should first have a clear description of what the product is for. What's the function? Is there a performance standard that it has to meet? Any legal requirements that is required for the product? What's the role of the chemical of concern? Is it even necessary to be in the product? And when identifying alternatives, don't limit yourself in just thinking of chemical substitution. Responsible entities can consider a broad range of options. such as reformulation or even evaluating the similar materials that can perform the same function. For example, if looking for an alternative for a plastic container, they may consider a different plastic polymer or a totally different material, glass, aluminum, steel. It is the responsibility of the entity to show and justify their decision about selection of alternatives. The appendix of Chapter 2 provides and suggests sources of data when searching for alternatives. Once alternatives are identified, a list of factors need to be evaluated and determine if they're relevant. Identification of relevant factors is a necessary step to reduce the time and resources required to complete the AA, because by identifying the relevant factors, you eliminate from consideration the factors that will not have any meaningful contribution on the comparison between the priority product and the alternatives. Two requisite criteria define a relevant factor. First, a factor must make a material contribution to impacts on public health, environment, end of life, or materials and resource consumption. So it must make a material contribution. The second criteria is that there should be a material difference in the factor's contribution to the impacts. Simply stated, a relevant factor is a factor that is important to the comparison of priority product and the alternatives. The guide provided examples to clarify this definition. This is just a very simple example, hypothetical, and it's showing that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the 5 life cycle segments of the product and the alternative. They are showing the emissions. We can see from this graph that almost on all life cycle segments, except for the use phase, that emissions are almost similar. But on the use phase, the red bar, let's assume that's the alternative. The alternative is emitting almost twice as high as the priority product. So we can say that there's this material difference between the alternative impacts and the product impacts. However, if you look at the total for the full life cycle of the product and alternative, the cumulative emissions, the contribution of the use phase is not much. So it may not have that material contribution to the adverse impact on the air quality. So this can be considered as non-relevant. These are the list of factors that the regulations list that must be considered for relevance. It includes the adverse environmental impacts, the adverse public health impacts, adverse waste and end-of-life effects. So I won't be reading all of this list, but what is important to note is that there are additional factors nested within the definitions of these impacts. For example, adverse environmental impact is defined to include adverse air quality impacts, adverse water quality impacts, adverse ecological impacts, and adverse soil quality impacts. So within those definitions, there are additional factors that can be expanded. And the guide tried to make and clarify these definitions. And in an appendix, it provided this expanded list of factors. As you can see on the second column about the adverse environmental impact, it expands to, on the third column, to include adverse air quality impact, adverse ecological impact, adverse soil quality impacts, and it's not showing the bottom part, which is the adverse water quality impacts. And within the definition of an adverse air quality impacts are more list of gases. So these are the factors that need to be considered when trying to identify relevant factors. And responsible entities can refer to this appendix when identifying relevant factors and use it to check if all factors have been considered in their analysis. In the identification of relevant factors, the full life cycle of the product is considered. For each life cycle segment, consider how the priority product compare with the alternatives with regard to impact. Are there additional releases or exposure that during any life cycle segment if the alternative is implemented? Identifying relevant factors is an iterative process. It may be possible that after more information is gathered, a factor that is initially determined to be relevant may turn out to be otherwise. For example, just like the previous example that we showed on the last slide, and another example would be if, for example, initially it was determined that emissions are similar for the priority product and alternative, but after considering the useful life or the service life of the alternative, if it turns out that it will last twice as long as the priority product, then the impacts or the emissions may significantly differ. Also, when identifying relevant factors, schematic representations such as conceptual models may help communicate the interactions of hazards, fate and transport, potential exposure scenarios. And the guide provided an example of a conceptual model. This slide shows a very simplified model about alternative A. It has been determined that alternative A will have these human health impacts, that during use it will generate dust and eventually end up on the wastewater system or storm drains to result in some aquatic toxicity. On the disposal phase, it's sent to an incineration, whose emissions will also be an impact to aquatic toxicity. So when comparing this alternative, responsible entities can also do the same on a priority product. And if we look at the total life cycle of the system, and we on this use phase, we know the alternative A released will cause this aquatic toxicity and human health impacts. And on the left side, the priority product containing chemical X, you may also be doing the same. And we also discussed that on the disposal phase during incineration, that would impact, that would result in aquatic toxicity. And this slide just shows you that if you consider these are different life cycle segments, you may be able to visually see and help in the determination of relevant factors. During the identification of these relevant factors, impacts of the products and of the alternatives are also being identified. Data gathering forms the core of impact assessment. The responsible entity collects information about the chemicals, the physical chemical properties, the hazard traits, and other information needed to determine the impacts of the alternative or even the product. Some data are commonly available, such as the physical properties, while some may be more difficult to obtain. During the initial stage, responsible entities may use qualitative assessment if there's not enough data, not enough available, readily available quantitative data. And this chapter provides a brief description of approaches if the data are not available, there's no experimental or measured data available. Although there's only a brief description about these approaches, Chapter 9, which is under development, we'll be discussing more about data gathering and data gaps. Also, in doing impact assessments, a number of organizations have developed tools to help summarize and readily compare the hazards of chemicals. Note that these tools may have a varying degree of hazard endpoints being considered. So when using hazard assessment tool, responsible entities need to determine which relevant factors, as listed on our regulations, are being addressed by these comparative tools, and if there are some relevant factors not being addressed, that they have to supplement their analysis with other methods. This chapter also provides the resource, and there's a list of tools and methods, and provide descriptions of these tools and methods that can be used for impact assessment or chemical hazard assessment. This is the final step on the first stage process, the screening of alternatives. This is where all of the information gathered in the previous steps, the identification of relevant factors, the assessing the impacts, is being used and considered to determine what alternatives would proceed for further determination on the second stage. The goal is to narrow the number of alternatives to focus on the second stage. This will establish a meaningful scope of alternatives for further consideration. Responsible entities can use the comparative chemical hazard assessment tools mentioned before when comparing impacts. Can use other approaches like a matrix comparing all of these different hazard traits. So if an alternative is obviously superior than the priority product or obviously inferior, then comparative will be very easy. The screening will be very easy. But then most of the time, this is not the case. An alternative may be better or contributing less impact on one area, but may be worse on some other areas. And trade-off assessment is one of the challenges in decision making. It may require that responsible entities use their corporate values to determine what's important, what's an important factor. And because the regulations favor alternatives that are safer, factors that deal with public health and the environment can be at the top of the priority. Marginal alternatives may be re-evaluated because selected alternatives may not work after further evaluation. So marginal alternatives should not be totally be discarded. The regulations do not specify a process on how to screen alternatives. So responsible entities may use a variety of approaches, but they should document their rationale, show their work in the preliminary report. In summary, the guide provides a menu of options, a menu of approaches, and does not provide a single cookbook step-by-step process. The responsible entity will decide which approaches, assumptions, tools, or decision frameworks that they will have to use. But even given this flexibility in performing the analysis, they must ensure that elements of the analysis must be consistent with the regulatory requirements, that it's scientifically robust, complete, and transparent. The responsible entity must document the data quality and the decision-making method. Again, the alternative analysis process is iterative, and we have talked about that. And the product or the outcome, the main product of this first stage analysis is the preparation of the preliminary report and work plan for the implementation of the second stage analysis. So this preliminary report will be posted on our website, including the work plan, and DTSC will review for compliance, review for deficiency, and also if it's okay and be approved and proceed with the second stage process. So this is, again, this DTSC wants your feedback. The guide is for you. We want your feedback on how we can make the guide useful. Are there tools and approaches that you are currently using that are not mentioned in the guide? We provided examples in the guide, but then if you feel that you have some additional examples that make it more clear about a specific topic, we appreciate your input. And comments can be submitted through CalSafer by October 23 at this link. And with that, there's again, there will be a next webinar on October 21st, same time. And if you feel that you need additional discussion about a specific topic that was not elaborated in this webinar, there will be a survey after this presentation requesting for your input on what topics you may want to be discussed for this next webinar on October 21st. And again, the draft Stage 2 Alternative Analysis Guide may be ready for public comments by spring of 2016. The chapters that I have shown for the Stage 2 are currently under internal review, and we expect them to be ready for public comments by that time next year. Carl, any closing?
Yes, well, thank you, Relly, and thank you, everyone, for participating. We're just compiling some of the questions that have come in, and Relly will go through those at this time. And I just want to encourage you that it's to keep submitting questions and comments through our CalSafer site. We appreciate it. And please participate in the survey that we'll send out to you at the end of this webinar. Billy?
Okay. So thank you, Carl. And we have some questions that we received through the chat. And we'll be responding to these questions. And if you have some other questions too, please use the chat box to post your questions. There's one question here. Performance, cost, and consumer acceptance are not included in relevant factors, but they should be. They will clearly be among the factors considered. So that's a comment. Our response that performance is actually required to be evaluated as an initial step when identifying the product requirements. Although that's only initial performance, but then that will again be done and required to be done on the second stage during the in-depth analysis. Cost is also part of the stage 2 analysis. So these factors, this performance and cost, will be addressed on the second stage in-depth analysis. So that we don't need to screen any alternatives out due to cost during this initial screening stage. And I agree that these are important factors that need to be considered. Question number 2. Do the phase 2 chapters have to be published before this guidance is considered in effect? Yes. We'll be having the same process wherein we will be publishing these phase 2 chapters, and we'll have a webinar similar to this one to solicit comments before we make a final guide that will be the one that will be considered to be in effect.
Let me just add to that. This is Carl. That it is just guidance. So I'm not sure if the intent was to say when will it be done. It won't be done probably ever in some sense, because we will continue to make it a living and breathing guidance document. In terms of effect, it's not a regulatory requirement. It's just guidance. So we hope to expand it as we go on and get further good information and more experience in the process and actually seeing the AAs come in, evaluating them, and building the community of practice.
Thank you, Carl. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Another question is, will there be additional guidance on the 2 exemptions related to contaminants?
I'm going to introduce Nancy Ostrom, who's a senior scientist on our team, who's going to help in answering some of these questions.
So, this is Nancy Ostrom. We didn't talk a lot about the exemptions in the process. There are other types of alternative assessments, and then there are other exemptions within the entire regulatory process that may apply. And so we made a decision for this guide to focus just on the alternatives analysis process and not to spend a lot of time focusing on exemptions. And I think that what our group will do ultimately is prepare some additional guidance materials that talk about some fact sheets or other types of guidance materials that do talk about other exemptions and some of the other exemptions that apply within the regulatory process. Oh, do you want me to do number 4 also?
Sure.
Okay. So the next question, guidance indicates that all available data must be gathered. Under REACH and HPV programs, extensive efforts have been taken to assemble, rank for reliability, and assess most, if not all, data on over 8,000 chemicals. Is the guidance suggesting that all of that work must be redone, or can the responsible entity draw from those data summaries? We fully expect the responsible entities to draw from work that other people have done. The work does not have to be original. And in the regulations, there's a requirement that they use available data. And so we would assume that data that other entities have gathered is considered available.
An additional question says, a common question we've been getting is how are companies assured of intellectual property protection when reporting their formulations? The guide doesn't directly deal with that because those provisions are specified in detail in our regulations, and that's what's the guide for that and the rule in terms of how we will accept those claims, evaluate them, and consider them in going through the process. And then the next question is, what about if we just decide to delete the chemical of concern? Again, our regulations provide for a formal process where you can submit a removal notification whereby you don't have to do an alternatives analysis. And that, again, is stipulated and outlined in our regulations. There are a variety of alternatives, off-ramps, things that you can do that either avoid you doing an alternatives analysis or path. The next question is, given the complexity of alternatives analysis, will DTSC be publishing a list of qualified contractors who can provide support to businesses? The simple answer to that is no, we won't. We had considered in earlier versions of the regulations a fairly extensive certification process, which we did not include in the final regulations. We are certainly aware that there are going to be people who are responsible for conducting an AA who will need help because they won't have the in-house capability to do all of the analysis, data crunching, and work that's required. We will continue to build the guide in terms of pointing people to good resources. I think nationally and internationally, those resources are building for a lot of different reasons and different frameworks, and we will help facilitate that, but we won't be choosing contractors that are qualified or not. The next question is, will the October 21 webinar be the same as today's? What our hope is that based on these questions and the feedback we get through CalSAFER, that we'll be able to see how this worked today or didn't work, and if there are some things that we need to address more specifically, give some more examples, and address the concerns that you all are raising today, so that the webinar on the 21st will be the new improved webinar based on that. The framework will be the same. It's really trying to get through the basic guidance and provide perspective.
Okay, this is Nancy Ostrom again for the next question. For Chapter 5, you mentioned the need to consider the screening goals. How do we ensure transparency and consistency in the goal of the AA between the responsible entity and the agency? This again goes back to what Carl was saying about telling your story in the report, and what Riley was saying about documenting everything. This is the crux of the alternatives analysis, is justifying what your goals are and how you've met them in your analysis. And so, you know, the ultimate goal of alternatives analysis is laid out in the regulations. But, you know, sub-goals, as Riley was talking about, particularly when you're considering trade-offs, in the first phase, in the draft phase, during the screening analysis, the trade-offs probably are less important to the analysis. They're probably more important to just be aware of, so that when you go into the second phase of the analysis, you can focus on how to further identify and how to handle those trade-offs. During the screening analysis, you don't necessarily have to resolve trade-offs. It's just something to really be aware of before you're going into the second phase of the analysis. And then to further expand on Riley's comment on the earlier question about considering other relevant factors, the regs do allow one to consider the relevant factors in the second phase. During the first phase, you just can't screen out all the alternatives and leave yourself with no alternatives at that point. If you are screening out alternatives based on additional factors, you just have to put that in your documentation and explain why you've done that.
Okay, the next question, to ensure a good understanding of the goals of the AA, is there or should there be an opportunity for a pre-consultation as part of the process? Well, one thing to consider is that right now we're talking somewhat broadly in terms of the process in general. The process will specifically apply to those responsible entities who are responsible because we've identified a specific priority product. As we do that, as many of you participated, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of dialogue about that specific priority product. The same will be true once we move into the AA phase, is that we anticipate we'll have a lot of dialogue with responsible entities, with trade associations, with people who are going to be part of the process. We'll be somewhat limited by our staffing and bandwidth. There won't be a formal pre-consultation process, but we will be in active dialogue as we move forward, and I hope that we'll be able to both answer questions and give people useful perspective as we go through the process.
The next one is, what are the primary regulatory documents we're referring to for the alternatives analysis? There really is only one regulatory document, and that's our regulations. And the citation is the California Code of Regulations, Division 4.5, Chapter 55. The title is Safer Consumer Products. Begins with Section 69501. However, the alternatives analysis portion of the regulations pretty much begin
505.
505, yeah, 69505, Article 5, Alternatives Analysis. So that's primarily where the process and the framework for the alternatives analysis has been laid out. There are references to other sections of code and earlier sections within that code. So there's a little bit of jumping around. But that portion of the regulations is available on our website.
So there's the next question, which is sort of a clarification question from the earlier one. It says the question about in effect was meant to clarify the past statement that the regulations don't come into effect until the guidance is completed. With this first half of guidance now public, does that mean the regulation is now in effect? Well, let me clarify it, I think. Our framework, Safer Consumer Product regulations, are in effect right now. We're required to come out with our guidance prior to the first point where a responsible entity has to start the alternatives analysis process. That will not happen until we adopt in regulations, formally, listing regulations for each priority product, which we're going to be starting this fall and the beginning of 2016. So as we go through that process to adopt in regulation the list of priority products, once those are final, that's when the clock starts for the requirements for alternatives analysis. We will be completing the second stage AA guide prior to that date. So the guidance will be complete, and then before anyone is required to do an AA. I wanted to go back and allude to my earlier comment saying that it'll never be complete, in that we plan on it being a living, breathing, growing document, resource tool. But yes, we will have the guidance complete before anyone's required to do an AA.
And again, as we emphasized during the presentation, the guide is not a regulatory document. We already have the regulations in effect, and the guide just tries to clarify and describe the process that are already in the regulations.
Yeah. So the next one asks about, does the guide address how to weigh data gaps within the various factors and sub-factors used to compare alternatives? We do have a chapter that talks about data and data gaps. It is in the second phase of the guide, and it's primarily used in the second phase of the analysis. And so we're not really prepared to talk a lot about that right now, but the guide will address how to address those data gaps. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Meredith brings up a very good point, that the regs do not require that responsible entities actually have to fill data gaps. They can get through their analysis just taking those data gaps into account, And one of the response actions at the end of the process might be then to gather data, or it might be to proceed with the data gaps.
Okay. There's a question again on, will you be setting up a training program for use of any of the tools covered in the guidance or for use of the overall guidance? Yes, there's a plan on giving a training, and as a matter of fact, we are working with Clean Production Action to provide some training on their chemical hazard assessment tool on the green screen. And we will inform about the availability of this training once it gets established or set up. And
yeah, and I think I'd like to point out we're also going to be hopefully developing additional tools, and as the guidance develops, we may choose to do some specific training on elements of the guide. And if you have suggestions about certain tools or things that you think would be helpful for us to sponsor some training or to provide additional guidance, we'd appreciate that as well.
There's a question on, should identification of alternatives consider functional alternatives? That is, different product types that some may feel serve a similar function but not the same product? Definitely. So if there's a different product that can serve and fulfill the function of the original product, and it doesn't contain the chemical of concern, and it will be considered as a safer alternative, then definitely that would be an alternative that can be considered.
The next question, how does one make the ultimate decision to switch to alternatives or not after doing the trade-off analysis? Is there a model that quantifies all the factor impacts, for example, gives an overall grade? Would that be, that would make all our lives easier? No. So ultimately, the ultimate decision to switch to alternatives really is the crux of the alternatives assessment, and it's really the thing that happens sort of at the end of the assessment when you're getting through the second phase. And that's sort of the ultimate decision-making approach at that end. The regulations don't specify a particular process for making that decision, so the responsible entity will have to make a decision for themselves about how they're going to make that decision. In the second half of our guidance, we have a chapter on decision-making that provides a number of different approaches for approaching this decision. Some of them are quantitative, some of them are qualitative, and it's really going to depend on the responsible entity and their own set of preferences and values for making that decision in the light of those trade-offs. The bottom line, though, is that all of the information that's considered in that decision-making process has to be clearly outlined in the final report so that the department can understand how the decision was made, and that's the essence of the transparency element of these requirements.
The next question is it possible to extend the amount of time available to stakeholders to provide meaningful feedback past the October 23rd deadline? It is possible. We've already received a couple of requests to extend that deadline, which we're considering. As we get feedback, we'll make a decision on that and may provide some additional time. Again, it's not a regulatory time frame. There's no mandated drop-dead date. It's mostly to encourage getting the early feedback so we can have an improvement for the next webinar, as well and getting information to the grasp and move the process along. Regardless of when the date ultimately is, we always take feedback, and it's not a formal process, but we will consider extending that deadline. The next one is, given the complexity of the AA, will DTSC provide case studies that highlight the approach that should be taken?
Yeah, one of the things that we are always looking for are case studies, and we've been working with some people to develop some. We've included some examples in the guide. There will never be an approach that should be taken because for each responsible entity, the approach may be different. because they're all looking at different factors for their own situation. But we do hope to provide additional case studies that provide examples of how other people have approached some of these issues. And that's one of the things that we would be very interested in receiving from people through the CalSAFER comment portal, is examples of case studies or examples of other types of analyses that might relate and be helpful to other people. Oh, and not necessarily the entire case study. If there are elements of the case study that might be useful to people who are doing this analysis, those are welcome as well.
Next question, what is the estimated cost for conducting an AA? Well, that's a good question. I think it's going to depend largely on the specific product and the situation of the responsible entity. We don't, this is a new process that we haven't done before, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty that comes with that. And we're certainly sensitive that this is a rigorous process, and there will be impacts. But as we get more information, we'll certainly help people through the process. I will note that when we do the listing regulations, we will be doing an economic analysis that's required for that process. That process, which is dictated by the California Department of Finance, is a standard for all regulations. It's fairly broad, and we will have extremely limited data that we'll be dealing with in terms of what that cost might be. But that will be something that people might want to look at and give us feedback on. Next question, could you see a situation where a preliminary assessment would be sufficient for DTSC without a second stage AA? And I think that's...
I think there's a second question after this one, and I think these are related questions. The next question is, if it can be demonstrated that no alternative exists which has the same performance for the existing product, is demonstrating this be sufficient for the abridged AA? To do this kind of analysis, I think the steps required in doing the preliminary stage AA are still required to show and demonstrate that that there is no technically economically available product that could replace the existing product. So the responsible entity shall justify and demonstrate that and show the evaluation, still identify the relevant factors, still identify the impacts, still identify the function. So basically the screening analysis steps will still be done to perform and report on the abridged AA. So I don't know if that answers the question. Can you add?
Yeah, it just depends on how the analysis was done, whether or not it can be demonstrated sufficiently. And it's also important to remember that response actions will still be required under the abridged AA. You'll still need to notify consumers and advance green chemistry by helping to design safer alternatives. So it's not necessarily easy.
Okay, I think we have a couple more questions. Does DTSC plan to provide any guidance on creating consortia for developing AAs? The short answer to that is no. Our regulations provide that opportunities for collaboration for responsible entities conducting AAs, provides for the use of existing AAs. So in the market of people who are on the hook to do AAs, there's lots of opportunity for collaboration and coordination, and we're going to need to leave that up to each individual business and their business plan and model. We'll be available certainly to support that, and I think it's important that we hope and expect that people will take advantage of that opportunity. but it won't be specifically addressed in the guidance. The next question is, could you provide the timeline for the first batch of products that are in this process? And yes, in general I can. And you can look on our website at the 3 products that we're proposing to list as priority products. Briefly, those are children's foam-padded sleep products that contain 2 flame retardants, TDCP and TDCP, spray polyurethane foam systems that contain MDI, and paint strippers with methylene chloride. We originally had planned to put all of these 3 products into one rulemaking package that we would adopt. We've subsequently decided to break that into 3 different packages because they're really 3 different products with 3 different sets of stakeholders and issues. Our plan is that we will first come up with our children's foam-padded sleep products package late this year, early next year, and then that will be followed by one of the next 2 shortly on their heels. And those will each be a full-blown rulemaking process. We'll have put a public notice out with a 45-day comment period. We'll include our initial statement of reasons and the technical documents supporting our decision-making of why we think these should be the first priority products. Once each of those rules are formally adopted, again, that's when the requirements start for the responsible entities to notify us they're a responsible entity and to initiate the timeline for conducting alternatives analyses. So that's the broad picture. I think that concludes the questions that we received online. Again, thank you very much for your participation. Please give us your comments through CalSafer. Please fill out the survey that you'll get and stay with us on this journey. It's a first step. We really need your engagement and feedback, and we're committed to making it work as best we can for everyone. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.